My name's Paul Harrison. I'm the MBA program director at the Deakin Business School, and I want to start our event by acknowledging and thanking the Wurundjeri elders, past and present, for their ongoing care and stewardship of this beautiful land where we're having our event tonight. I'm a descendant of the Kulgoa Wari people, along with British and Scandinavian heritage. I was raised in Ngunnawal country and now live near the Mary Creek. And interestingly, when I was thinking about this topic tonight, I was thinking the topic of uncertainty and complexity is something that's particularly pertinent to First Nations people and their ancestors. Grappling with dispossession and colonisation has been part of First Nations culture for many hundreds of years. In Australia in particular, drawing upon the wisdom and knowledge that's passed on through our 65,000 years of culture and learning and knowledge is something that many of us would benefit from engaging with. And tonight, we continue the First Nations tradition of storytelling and listening. And in the spirit of that tradition, we go into this event with a sense of curiosity to understand our world and each other just that little bit better. So a bit of background, I've just realised talking to Gini that this is the 6th MBA Big Think, which is kind of cool that we've done this many. I actually thought it was number 5 and then I counted them up and I went, whoa, okay, there's 6. The first ever Big Think was conducted kind of in the height of COVID when there was a lot of uncertainty, but we were allowed to be in rooms together, and then I got COVID and had to host it online while everybody else sat in the room. It was hilarious. I guess the thing about the MBA, so I've been the MBA director since 2022, and one of the things I wanted to do as the MBA director was allow our MBA students and our partners and our alumni to grapple with bigger questions than purely the questions that we grapple with, I guess, at our technical level. That idea that we want to understand things that are maybe part of our professional life, but also part of just generally our life. The move beyond that kind of technical specialisation and looking at the world from a broader perspective is a really critical part of our MBA. It is about moving people from being technical specialists to being generalists, to being able to understand their impact, how decisions that they make have all sorts of consequences. It kind of forms the whole way that we have approached this MBA. And one of the things that we kind of talk about a lot with our MBA is that you make it your MBA with Deakin. And again, we're moving towards that idea of making it much more about a flexible, approachable MBA program. And I want to talk to you about some of those elements at the end, with some of those initiatives that we're developing and in this space. So why are we doing this particular topic? Complexity and uncertainty has always been part of being human. But in modern culture, modernity in a way, there has always been this sense that our leaders, our trusted institutions, our mum and our dads can help us through many of our more complex challenges. Modernity promised control and maybe even command over the anxiety that comes with complexity and uncertainty. But I think one of the major things that we've learned in the past 4 or 5 years is that we may not necessarily be in as much control as we thought we were. A spiky ball of genetic material coated in fatty chemicals called lipids and measuring 8 billionths of a centimetre came along to shake us out of our slumber. Things that we took for granted, we no longer were able to take for granted. Beliefs, systems and values were challenged. In management, as we kind of would have learned, we've always been told that when it comes to uncertainty, it's important to plan, to be strategic, to set objectives and be focused on achieving those objectives. But setting objectives is just a human response to try and manage feelings of uncertainty. Planning and objective setting is significantly more emotional than it is rational. Faced with the anxiety of what the future looks like, we invest even more in our preferred vision of the future. Not because it helps us to achieve it, but because it helps us get rid of uncertainty in the present. Uncertainty encourages us to idealise the future. We tell ourselves that everything's going to be okay just as long as we can reach that projection of the future. In fact, psychological research tells us that we fear uncertainty more than we fear death itself. And we'll go to extraordinary lengths, even risky and dangerous ones, to get rid of that uncertainty. In business and in life, it's quite alarming when we think about how many major corporate and life decisions we make primarily to minimise present moment emotional discomfort. To help us ameliorate some of these existential discomforts, we've assembled a motley crew of big thinkers. James Saretta is the Group Strategy Director for JB Hi-Fi, and he joined JB in 2016 after working as a management consultant for over 20 years. With the acquisition of The Good Guys, James took on the role of Group Strategy Director, working with both JB Hi-Fi and The Good Guys. Prior to his work at JB, James was a management consultant focused on strategy development and facilitation across a number of industries, including retail, telco, high-tech and government. And most importantly for me, James is a Deakin MBA alumni. Professor Patrick Stokes is a philosopher and associate professor at Deakin University. He's a leading expert on the philosophy of Søren Kierkegaard, along with interests in personal identity, the philosophy of death, and moral psychology. And you may have read Patrick's essays on the conversation, one in particular, No, You're Not Entitled to Your Opinion, which as of today, when I checked the conversation website, had 2.8 million reads, with nearly 1.4 of those readers coming from the United States. I'm not sure what that says. If you haven't read it, I would recommend it thoroughly. And Dr. Gini Weber is a lecturer in the Department of Marketing in Deakin Business School. Gini specialises in research on consumer psychology. Broadly, Gini's research focuses on influences on consumers, and this includes research on subject areas like word-of-mouth recommendations, social interactions, social rejection, and negative feedback, and work on why and when consumers dispose of possessions. And the sad news is that Gini will be leaving Deakin soon, which makes me very sad. Because she brings a level of intellect and intelligence to our faculty that is often difficult to find in such a small package. So I want to start with a general question to the panel, and I will join you in a moment. It's a big fundamental question, but can we define complexity? Is it just a property of the world, or is it a product of our minds, or is it both? And maybe I'll start with you, Patrick.
Can we define complexity? This is an interesting one because, of course, there's a kind of complexity that's just in random chaos, but that's not the interesting kind. So there's just sheer randomness. But that's not where complexity kind of becomes interesting in a conceptual way. What's interesting about complexity is where complexity gives rise to new properties. Okay. Right, this is what we call emergentism, right? So you've got a whole bunch of atoms all flying around and then they just combine in a certain way and suddenly you've got a molecule that can do certain things it couldn't do before, particularly when it combines with other molecules. You've got a bunch of cells all sort of arranged like a big squishy electric oyster, and suddenly with trillions and trillions of connections between those cells, consciousness emerges from it in a way that we still don't fully have a good theory for, but somehow it does. So it's this point about emergent properties that emerge from complexity. So complexity is not simply just having lots and lots of different variables in a kind of a chaotic way. It's also about interesting properties starting to emerge from that.
It's kind of a neatness to it as well, is that kind of embracing it makes it neat in a way.
Yeah, I mean, there's neatness, yes, but then there's also the thing that we often try and control complexity by simply saying things like, well, it's complex or whatever else. And so we sort of, we kind of sort of try and coat it and demarcate it and circumscribe it.
Yes.
Much as I'm trying to do now to avoid having to say anything more interesting or enlightening about the nature of complexity.
Oh, we'll get there. Gini, your thoughts. Is it something that we can define? Is it a fundamental property just of existence, as Patrick has kind of pointed out, or is it something that's just in our heads? You're the psychologist here.
I mean, we won't go down the rabbit hole of everything. It's all just in our heads. No, I mean, recently I've been doing a little bit of work on service systems. I've been talking about complexity in the service system. So one of the ways, not the only way, but one of the ways that we can think about complexity and how I would currently define it is based around, complexity can exist within a system. We can put the bounds on where we want to call that system, whether it's a small system, a large ecosystem. And complexity is about the number of interactions that occur within that, those atoms that hit each other randomly within whatever scope of system that we might be talking about. And so complexity is fundamentally about the number of different things that occur there and the number of interactions. So fast things are changing? Is that going to promulgate more interactions between the agents within that system? And is that going to lead to new emergence from those interactions? So I think it's not just about how many things there are, it's about how they're interacting with one another. Then kind of coming back to Patrick's point around, that leads to emergence of interesting things.
James, your thoughts?
I'm not even going to try and argue with any of that, but I'm going to stick in my lane and say it does exist. Whether you can define it or not, I have no idea.
Yeah.
But if I think about it from a perspective from a business strategy perspective, I think we create it a lot of times, and somewhat unnecessarily is probably an argument that I'd make.
Do you have a sense of why that happens? So, maybe not be intentional, but you're saying it happens. So what happens to make that?
I don't know what happens, but I think, I was reading some stuff maybe a month ago when we first started talking about this, and there was an idea that 40 or 50 years ago, you, as a business, you had a choice. Did you go for quality or did you go for price? Now it's quality, price, service, reliability, personalisation, responsiveness, global. It's like all this other stuff that we've added to the conversation. But over and above that, I think as things get complex, our business's response and our human response is to actually add complication, which then just propagates the complexity rather than trying to simplify stuff.
Is there a psychological reason why we want to add complexity? Humans kind of push towards that?
Well, I don't know if I could say there's a specific reason, but to me it harkens back a little bit to our desire to create categories for things. Cognitively, we like categories and we sort of automatically create them even if they don't necessarily need to exist. And what James was just talking about, so we have all of these other factors around, global and reliable and service and all these other things. That to me looks a little bit like our desire to create these categories of what our product offering can fall into, what we can offer. It's not just under this umbrella of quality. We've now made all these different types of quality or attributes. So I think in our desire to categorize, we create complication.
Yeah. And that comes from a control perspective as well, like to feel like we have a sense of control. Is that your thinking?
I mean, I think it can. It's a sort of fundamental property of how our minds work. But it's a desire to create order, categorize so we know what to do with that thing. If it falls in this category, we can then predict its behavior and how to approach it. So I do think it relates to that uncertainty and the anxiety to say, okay, I know what to do with that, and now I've resolved that psychological anxiety or tension.
Have humans always operated that way, Patrick, that they want to create categories? I mean, even like early philosophy and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, arguably, we literally can't think without doing that. We literally can't use language. We can't, categorization is kind of important in that way. But the attempt to impose categorical schemas, I think, is a pretty deeply human thing. The problem with that, of course, is that some schemas map onto things better than others. And then sometimes also there's questions around whether those schemas are actually interoperable. So whether my schema and your schema are or not, there's a huge debate in philosophy of language as to whether we can even have competing schemas or whether that's actually kind of impossible. And then it's kind of like, well, what do you do when a concept isn't actually working? Do you just make a whole bunch of ad hoc rationalizations, or you complexify it and say, well, this bit here, this is a special case, or here's a little subcategory we hadn't thought of, or whatever, until you've got this huge bloated edifice, or do you strip it all back and start from first principles? And are you even capable of doing that? And if you can, are you going to necessarily get anything better or not?
Are we as humans limited from even being able to strip it back to first principles?
Well, we're limited, but also there's a whole bunch of practical things that kind of stop us from doing that. I mean, the way scientific paradigms is a classic example of this, right? So very often people don't sort of follow a theory out and then go, oh, that's not working, let's go look for another theory, right? They stick with that theory or that theoretical paradigm, whatever it is. Niels Bohr once said, science advances one funeral at a time. And the reason for that is because people don't go, oh, hang on, that theory over there is doing better, I'm going to swap. Yeah. It's just you have these competing theories and one's not going anywhere and one is. So over time, one gets more adherence and the adherents of the first one quietly retire or die. So there's a whole bunch of, I think, inertial things that sort of hold us back from actually changing those schemas up. And I think you certainly see that in business. It's something where, that's a lot of corporate thinking tends to do precisely that. This is a framework that we're all deeply committed to. And it's very hard to sort of junk that and start afresh.
Do you see that, James, in your experience?
Yeah,
that people just hang on to things?
Yeah, and in part I think it's because we kid ourselves that we have control over lots of stuff that we actually don't. And so our ability to actually decide what we and identify what we can control and can't control, I think, is absolutely core to all of it. But you see it all the time. You see organisations kind of double down on a strategy or double down on a process or double down on an architecture. I mean, we only got to talk about some of the money that big organisations spend on IT systems or redesign. Like they're just going, right? And a lot of times it's wrong. But they're so into it by that stage that it's kind of hard to back out.
What would you say, James, are the kind of leadership skills then to overcome those, I don't know, what do we call them, biases, those?
I reflect a lot on, so 8 years at JB, so I reflect a lot about JB as a business. When I was a management consultant, every client said, we're really unique, and they weren't. Mm-hmm. And I kind of feel like now that I've been at JB for 8 years, I'm kind of going, wow, this place is really unique.
You need to get out.
Maybe I was wrong then or now. It doesn't really matter. But one of the things that comes to light is the ability to trust people to do what they need to do, and have a singular focus on the stuff that really matters, whether that's a metric or a handful of metrics, but keep it as simple as possible. And I think, again, if I reflect on JB, that's one of the things that they do really, really well.
At an individual level, Gini, how then do individuals kind of navigate that complexity? Like you talked about, the need to control and things like that, but, how do we process that? I know it's a big question.
It's a very big question.
Can you just fix it, please?
Well, one of the things that's just sort of come to mind in this conversation is the sunk cost fallacy.
Right.
We certainly do stick with things that aren't working. And sometimes it takes something outside of our paradigm to shake us up a little bit out of our own ways of doing things. But to build on what James just said, I think sticking or having a specific a value or something, a personal goal, but something that you care about that is what am I trying to accomplish here, can help, even in terms of theoretical paradigms, say, well, what isn't working? And if you really focus on what is my end goal and what is serving me versus not serving me, that can help overcome some of these biases and sunk cost fallacies and other challenges that we have. Not sure if I actually answered your question at all, Paul. I think I took it in a different direction.
No, that's fine. That's what the whole point of the complexity conversation is about. I'll ask you, Patrick, too. Part of the topic is complexity and uncertainty. Can accepting uncertainty in a way lead to better human outcomes? Is that that kind of approach, which is say, if I can accept that the world's going to be uncertain, I'll have a better life.
Well, yeah, if we take, and I will preface this by saying I am phenomenally bad at this. I'm not somebody who lives well with uncertainty by any means, but certainly there's a big philosophical tradition of this.
Yeah.
That if you, by trying to secure certainty where such things are not possible, by trying to sort of reassure yourself that things are going to go a certain way when you don't have control, by trying to, give yourself the illusion of control, or fretting over things that you can't change, doing that is going to lower your quality of life. That's a very Greek kind of idea. You get that particularly with Greek, but also some of the Latin thinkers like Marcus Aurelius and others who come out of that tradition, like sort of Stoic traditions and some of the Epicurean and Epictetan traditions. Yeah. This idea that, it's a waste of energy to worry about things you can't change and so on. Equally, it's also legitimate to wonder just how good we are at identifying which things we actually can and can't change. And you mentioned Kierkegaard. One of the things I like about Kierkegaard is precisely that he's really good at sniffing out evasion. He's really good at sniffing out the way in which people are very good at saying, well, I can't do anything about this, or well, we'll think about this tomorrow, or whatever. And, when quite often we can, and there are things we can sort of do. And it is about what choices you make in light of that, in light of complexity, without evading things, without actually trying to hide in the complexity or sort of try and, beg off responsibility for the things that happen because it's complex.
Yeah.
Or it's uncertain.
I would build on that a little bit, bringing back to questions around the individual and what the individual can do. Something that I think is important for sort of navigating uncertainty and complexity in a healthy-ish way is a sense of self-efficacy or personal empowerment to change the things that an individual might be able to change. And there are some things under our control. So the feeling that I have the capacity to actually then go out and make that change, whether it's in an organizational manner, a sense of organizational, empowerment to make changes within the organization, or at a personal level, having the sense of self-efficacy to go out and say, yeah, I can do that. Even though the outcome's uncertain, I know what I can control, and that's what I'm going to pay attention to. I can help, I think, again, at that single individual level.
Do any of you think that a discourse around you have so many choices, why are you complaining, can create that anxiety? Like, I think one of the things in my field is that people go, well, like, look at all the choices you have. We're making your lives better because you have 20 choices of things. Like, can that also create that level of anxiety, uncertainty? Anyone?
I mean, I'll jump in there and say, in the sort of existentialist philosophical tradition, that's precisely what anxiety is. It's the feeling of freedom, right? Anxiety is what freedom feels like. It's the feeling that nothing compels me to act one way or the other, right? So, Jean-Paul Sartre says, if you stand on the edge of a cliff and you feel this sort of sense of giddying anxiety or angst or whatever, he says, it's not, oh gosh, I could be blown off this cliff by a strong wind, or I could lose my balance. It's nothing stops me throwing myself off. That's where the anxiety comes from. It's the sheer feeling of freedom itself, that nothing compels you either way, which sucks. And that was a big part of what Sartre said, was actually we spend so much of our time trying to run away from the choices that we have, or the capacity for choice that we have, because responsibility is actually really unpleasant.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, these are the existentialists. This is what they grapple with all the time. James, you're about to say something.
No, look, I was just thinking about what Ginny was talking about how you get an individual to take a drive. Like, I can't have a conversation at work without talking about purpose, and kind of for an organisation to articulate it, but more importantly to embed it. I think if you do that really, really well, then people just know. Like, people just know. They know what they've got to do 9 o'clock Monday morning, right? And some of that choice. Like, you give them freedom, but the choice goes away at the same time, which is just absolute. There's a freedom in kind of in the focus of knowing exactly what you've got to do.
Yeah. So related to that, there's a paper I read a few years ago about creativity, and it said if you just tell people to go out and make something, and they studied this, they gave people materials to make things. Their creativity wasn't anywhere near as effective and strong, and they didn't enjoy the task near so much as when they were given constraints on that creativity. They were still told, do something creative, go have fun with it, but within, these specific boundaries, this time limit or these other creative constraints. And then they enjoyed the task more and made more creative and innovative outcomes. Yeah. Humans want, a couple of boundaries, a couple of constraints within which to operate, helping with some of that anxiety, maybe a bar so they can't jump off the cliff, get that one out of the way.
Just helping them make that choice. You can go anywhere in Greece and there won't be a bar at the edge of the cliff, I can tell you. So I want to come back to, some of the other conversations that we've been having and to kind of lead to this. I mean, you talked about Kierkegaard, that whole idea of, that we create our own kind of anxiety. Kierkegaard also kind of focuses on the kind of subjective experience of individuals. And I mean, that subjective experience, how can we use that subjective experience to kind of manage complexity in those kind of social and maybe organisational systems as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things that Kierkegaard's really big on, I should say too, Kierkegaard's a religious thinker, and I don't share his religious commitments, but there's so much in him that I find really intriguing in the way he talks about subjectivity, which is often misunderstood. It's often as if he's saying nothing's really objectively true. It's just how, it's all subjective. And that's not what he's saying at all. In fact, what he's saying is in a sense quite the opposite, right? There are real facts that you need to respond to as the individual that you are, right? And so a big part of what he's trying to do is say you can't lose yourself in the crowd. You can't declaim all responsibility for things because, you know, I'm just one person or I'm just a cog in the machine, or even worse, I'm part of the public, which is everyone and no one. And he's writing at a time when the media is starting to create the public as a discursive entity, and he hates that because he's like, well, who is the public?
Is that kind of akin to the real world as well? Is that a similar kind of concept?
Yeah, I mean, I intensely dislike the real world because it's always used to sort of, as a phrase, because it's always used to sort
separation.
Of say, well, out here in the real world,
yeah.
You know, academics cop it a lot, right?
Yeah.
Particularly philosophy academics. We get them say, well, out in the real
so where do you live?
There's one real
you live
world.
in a magical world.
That's right. You know, our mortgages work the same way yours do.
Really?
And, you know, I just spend some of my day thinking about some different bits of it than maybe you do or maybe not. So, you know, anyway. But yeah, so that would be what I would say. It's just that I think a big lesson of Kierkegaard's is that you can't you have to keep reminding yourself, I'm an individual here living my life. I've only got so much of it. It could end at any moment. What am I going to do with it? What's the best thing to do there? And so he actually says at one point, you know, there's that old cliche about live every day as if it's your last. There's actually a point where he says, no, what you should be doing is living every day as if it's both the last and the first in a long life to come. Right. And that's complex, but that's also make your project counts, as in what matters is that you started well.
Right. So how, James, I was kind of thinking about this idea. Is there a kind of strategic equivalent to that kind of living your day as if it's your first and also your last?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's there is something about the choice you make right now, but I think it's about doing things. I think it's in part is letting people live with the long shadow of consequences, right? So you can make some decisions today and it's not going to bite you on the backside for a little while, but today kind of feels right. But if you're rewarded on what happens down the track, I think you're going to make different decisions. So, you know, I'd like to think from a strategy perspective, and my boss likes to think this, I'm not sure if it's true, he goes, you got to be kind of 3 years ahead of everybody else. You're not. You're a month ahead of everybody else. But I think, you know, people get rewarded on the quarter or the half or the year, and so they make decisions in there. But I think if you can stretch, you know, what we call kind of the shadow of consequence, then you'll get different decisions.
Is that kind of, I mean, I think about even some of the sustainability questions and things like that. Like the shadow of consequence there is
absolutely
significant. How do you build that into a quarterly report process?
Don't get me started on reporting, but look, I think it's the obvious one of just chunking it back, right? We know that the stuff we need to do today isn't for today; it's for 5, 10, 15 years time. But you've got to do it today, and if you don't do it today, then you kind of screw it up for everybody else. And there was a couple of things that really amazed me when I joined JB. One of them was one of the first exec meetings I went to. Someone said, "That's a really interesting decision. It's going to be hard because we put food on the table for 10,000 people." Now, we're talking about the people that work in stores. And I'd never heard that before. I'd never heard an organisation go, I've heard them go, that's going to cost us a lot, or we could lose a lot, or it's going to cost us market share, but not we put food on the table for 10,000 people. So, I mean, that really stretches the shadow of consequence beyond, you know, the exec table.
Patrick, before the session, you and I were talking about, and I can't remember exactly the detail, but the idea of how, I forget what you referred to it as, but how we think we're making the right decisions for now, but you know, we can basically look back at history and says, well, most of the decisions we made were wrong.
Yeah. So there's a great name for it in philosophy of science. In philosophy of science, they call it the pessimistic meta-induction.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Which
hashtag.
Yeah. Catchy, isn't it? No, but what it means is basically just that every theory we've ever had has turned out to be wrong. So why should the ones we think are right now turn out not to be? What are the odds?
Sounds like a budget process, really.
And the thing is, I'm interested in the way that also arguably applies to moral progress, right? I mean, moral progress largely happens through a process of realizing we were wrong all along. right? That things we took to be just obviously true, for instance, things about race, about gender, about sexuality, things we just thought were obviously true turn out not to have been true. And we need different responses and different approaches. And that being the case, it seems highly likely, just inductively, that we're going to turn out to be wrong about a whole bunch of things, that moral progress makes monsters of us all in the end. So if we're definitely going to be cancelled for something and we don't even know what it is yet, how do we respond to that? How do we have the kind of moral clarity and the moral certitude we need to make decisions, while at the same time acknowledging that we could turn out to be complete and are very likely on some things to turn out to be completely wrong? Probably wrong.
Gini, can that be really paralysing?
I mean, I think without a doubt, once you start to second guess every decision that you make from a moral lens and the fear of being cancelled for everyday decisions, it can create a sense of anxiety, which could lead to paralysis. But I think a lot of what we do is guided by moral norms. We look to our groups and our institutions for a certain perspective on, well, what should I be doing? And those will depend, on families, but also on peers and things changing, sometimes really rapidly, leaving a sense of disconnect or uncertainty about what's right in a given situation. There's no clear norm here. And I think people do disengage when that happens. If there's no norm, they don't know how to, what to say to an individual. They don't want to say the wrong thing, come across as maybe left-footed in a certain manner, and then they disengage instead of, and word you said right at the start, Paul, was curious. Talked about curiosity. And I think it causes us not to engage with the world in a curious manner when we're afraid to get it wrong. And I think that does slow progress a little bit.
I think I experienced that a lot too in kind of people dealing with First Nations issues as well, that I don't want to get it wrong. And it's actually, the preference would be get it wrong and, people will tell you when you've got it wrong. At least there's opportunity for change. James, can I kind of start with you, but for a question for the whole panel? This is where we get to the stage where we solve everything. So we've got 7 minutes to do that. So, strap yourselves in.
We've got it.
We've got it. So if we kind of now have talked about, how the interconnectedness and all of the kind of issues that we need to be thinking about, how does that help us to solve problems better or differently? Like, how can we use this knowledge to help us better approach decision making and problem solving?
I have no idea.
Okay.
But I think I go back to where the conversation started for me, which is we add complication and complexity by the decisions that we make in business. The simple example is, and it's not mine, I read it, was, in banks have a front office and a back office and they don't work together very well. So what did we do? We didn't fix the problem, we created a middle office. So now we've got two sets of problems. We've got the front office got an issue with the middle office got an issue with the back office. So we've got two sets of problems rather than one. And the way to fix that in the first place is to actually go back to the people that are in the system. So I'm a big one in saying there is no one more creative. Let's not get into the AI thing. There's no one more creative.
Well, we will.
No one more intelligent. There's no one more nuanced than actually the way humans reason their way through stuff. And if you can get people, this thing about creativity, if you can get people working on the same problems, engaged on the same problems, rewarding on the same things, they will solve it. So I think as kind of leaders, our opportunity and our almost our obligation is to create the environment where that can happen. Rather than add process, organisation, structure, new reporting lines, more reporting, more compliance.
Is that just because it feels like we're in control if we create more structures?
To be
frameworks?
A little bit all the way to one side, I think we kid ourselves that we're in control of some of this stuff. Sometimes we are, absolutely. But a lot of the times we just kind of go, well, we need to do something, right? Rather than trust the team to navigate their way through it.
Gini?
Yeah, I'm actually, with your question, taken back to being about 10 years old and overcomplicating everything in my life. Always.
Wow, at 10. I'm so sorry, Gini.
Part of why I can think of that age is because I really clearly have my childhood best friend's voice telling me, Gini, stop complicating things.
Okay.
It's not that complicated. So one of the things I think that we can do to help sort out some of this complexity and complicatedness in our lives is everything from our own perspective in our own lives and our own decision process looks really complicated because we're embedded at the center of it. But getting an outside perspective can often make things seem much simpler. I still do this today. It's no longer my childhood best friend who tells me to stop complicating things. It's normally my husband these days telling me, but isn't it just this? And I go, oh yeah, it is just that. But I've added about 7 or 27 intervening steps that don't really need to be there. So I think a big part of getting out of our own way is really shifting our perspective. And if we're struggling to do that, talking to another person can do that. And talking to another person within an organization can also just help cut through a lot of that clutter. Having conversations, I think, is really part of how we navigate this.
It's interesting because Maddie, my late wife, and I used to always talk about the idea of workshopping this, and I just love the workshop thing. It's just like, if it's a hard problem, workshop it, see what happens. Patrick, your thoughts?
I come back to that word creativity that James used. I mean, that, the worst thing you can do is think that problem solving is basically just an algorithmic process, and what matters is that you get the right algorithm, right? You just get the right decision procedure and it all falls out at the end of it. And with ethics, for instance, people are always looking for that. Like, what are the principles? Tell me what the principles are. Tell me how you operationalize those principles, and the answer will fall out the bottom. And that's not it. Ethics is a creative process as much as anything is. It's about managing different value sets of things that are intrinsically valuable, different kind of priorities, and uncertainty, epistemic uncertainty. There are a whole bunch of things we don't know, and also that point about uncertainty over time. We don't know what long-term consequences of things we do are going to be. You can't come at that through an algorithm. There is no one big decision procedure that you put the facts in one end and it comes out the other. Jeremy Bentham thought there was. He was wrong. And what is needed there is that kind of dialogical creativity that, when people talk about this, it's talking to another person opens things up in a different way. And that's where that sort of creative problem solving comes out of that. It doesn't come out of applying a set theory to a set of facts and seeing what falls out the bottom of it.
To go back to the algorithm, because I think it's something that people are interested in, and this is, again, for the whole panel, I'm happy for anyone to start it. So the rise of technology, AI, automation, big data, it gives us a sense of control. It gives us a sense of, categorization. How is it kind of shaping or reshaping how we experience and manage complexity and uncertainty? Anyone?
I'm not sure that the rise of technology has done much, to be totally honest.
Other than reassure us. Yeah, that's true.
If you take, I'm not an economist, but if you take just a pure productivity view, we've never been less productive, right? In terms of, you go back to the 50s and 60s, it's probably on a global basis, or in Europe, it's probably 7 or 8%. Now we're at sub 1, right? And we've never had more technology than we have now. So, I'm not sure that it's kind of answered the problem. It's not going to stop. It's not going to stop the rise of technology. And please keep buying your technology where you need to buy it. So I'm not sure. It's I think it's about being fit for purpose. I think it's about being really pointed as to where and how you use it. Otherwise, it just adds more complication and therefore more complexity.
Gini?
I would generally agree with that. I think a lot of the technology and the algorithms, I think some allow businesses to do certain functions really well. Some allow us to streamline our own individual processes. But a lot of it is just, here's a new shiny tool. And there are so many of them that they just increase the amount of choices that we have, increase the amount of decision difficulty, decision paralysis that we might have. And distract us sometimes from that core purpose or from, our actual aim for what we're trying to accomplish. So, I certainly I'm not a Luddite in any sense. I do think that there's a lot of really wonderful things through the advancement of technology and where the algorithms are taking us. But I think a lot of it is a distraction, which distractions can be fun. But I think maybe acknowledging, what do we need and not getting bogged down in the rest.
I'd just add that I think it's really important to be wary of the kind of fatalism around technology that is often part of these discussions, that it's going to happen, whatever you do. Like, this stuff's all going to happen and we can't do anything about it. So the best we can do is just kind of, diagnose what went wrong when things do go wrong. The American philosopher of technology, Don Idy, sometimes says that applied ethicists are always brought out in technology as the ambulance call, right? So they come in and clean up all of the stuff that's happened after the technology's appeared. With AI, I think we do have a moment, and it may be a very brief one, where we can actually sort of grasp the nettle and say, what do we want this to do for us and what don't we want it to do? I'm doing a project on the AI reuses of the things that dead people leave behind. There's a whole bunch of those ethical questions there, and there is a window in which we can say, this is who gets to make these decisions, this is how, this is for what purpose, for what period of time. We have a chance to actually make new norms and new expectations around this stuff. I think that's true of AI in general, that we do have a moment where we can say, no, actually, we're not just going to accept that you can train your models on absolutely anything regardless of who created it, or no, you're not actually going to do things that are going to displace these many jobs in this way. Let's do it consciously if the technology is going to be.
James, you're about.
I often wonder how much of technology in businesses is geared towards reporting. And why do we report? Is probably because we don't trust people to do the job we've asked them to do. So I keep coming back to the humans in the business and in the organisation, and how you get that working, I think solves so much.
Yeah, and it kind of leads me to the final question before we go to questions for people, open up for questions. But what would you, all three of you, would think are the essential skills or mindsets that we can cultivate or use individually, collectively, to better navigate a complex life, a complex workplace, a complex future?
I'll take the first stab at that one, because I think it comes back to that notion of curiosity.
Right.
I think keeping an open, curious mind and a willingness to engage is a big part of the challenge. If we lose that curiosity, if we shut down, if we disengage and avoid, that's just going to make everything worse. But if we're curious, it does, I think, help navigate a lot of this a lot smoother and have more fun doing it.
James?
Yeah, I'd absolutely echo it. I think there's something about curiosity. And I think in curiosity and creativity is this notion of fun. And I think if you can bring that kind of mindset to that, it'd be great if we didn't, if our kids didn't spend 12 years getting creativity beaten out of them. Yes. But that's a whole nother conversation.
It is indeed.
But that's when we face problems at work, my answer is always get people in a room and get and just throw it around, because you don't know where it's going to end up. So I think there's something about sort of engagement, curiosity, and
time
fun
to get people in a room as well. I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Patrick, I agree. I think curiosity. Ginny's absolutely right. Curiosity is absolutely vital, but also, as James is saying, responsiveness to people, openness and responsiveness. I think that's absolutely crucial. And I would also say trust is also a real factor there. And that comes into some of what James is talking about, that, I think trust is kind of essential to a lot of good things happening. And it's not something that's always entirely within our control. In some ways, trust is something that's almost experienced as if it comes from outside us somehow. And we just have to kind of let it do its thing. I think that's kind of essential to dealing with those issues.
So happy to open it up to any questions from the audience. We've covered a lot, and I think we've answered all of the questions now. The complexity sorted, uncertainty sorted. So really, if anyone has any questions, please just hand up. We won't have a mic. Andre.
I'm trying to think how to ask this question, right? So do you think complexity has led to further polarization? And if you look at the political spectrum, if you look at Israel-Palestine, if you look at COVID and anti-vaccines and so on, has complexity and the uncertainty that the environment we operate in, does that have a part to play in the polarized world we live in?
I'll make a stab at that one. Yes, in the sense of the complexity of available knowledge is a big part of that. So there's a particular story, and you can contest this history, but there's a particular story that I think makes a lot of sense, which is that from about the 18th century, we were being enjoined to know things for ourselves, not just to take them on the authority of the king or the church or whoever. And so we have the Enlightenment happen, and we generate a massive amount of new knowledge as a result of that. We generate so much new knowledge that no one can hold it all in their head, right? The sort of the period in which you have the sort of gentleman, and they were mostly all men, scholar who was across geology, astronomy, chemistry, criminology, all these things. That was very brief, if it ever really existed. Knowledge now is necessarily distributed across networks of knowledge generation and transmission. And that means that we're increasingly thrown back into trusting experts. We're increasingly thrown back into believing what we're told because we're not in a position necessarily to know or contest a lot of that information ourselves. That's fundamentally a good thing, but then that trust is fundamentally then a political question, right? How trustworthy are the institutions that do this generation? How much can we trust that they are acting in everyone's interests and not just their own interests? So I think that some of that polarization is in some respects a political response to political factors, but it also does map onto this condition of distributed knowledge in which we live now. In which we have to take a lot of things on trust because we fundamentally have no other option.
Anyone?
Yeah, I would just come back to that original notion of emergence as well. So complex systems have this property of emergence, and the more complex it is, not all that emergence is going to be positive. So complexity allows wonderful things to arise, but it also allows for negative consequences to arise. When we have systems that have become increasingly complex, sometimes the consequences that fall out are going to be negative. And one of the challenging facts that I think has been true for all of history and isn't going away anytime soon is that there are malicious actors willing to spread disinformation and take advantage of circumstances. And when so much is built on trust and there's so much out there, far too much for any individual to navigate, it does create opportunities for, that to be proliferated, for malicious actors to spread, and for then even good faith challenges to become increasingly big, polarized, and lead to really negative consequences like war, which we would always hope to avoid. So I don't think it's only about complexity. I think that there's more to it that creates the conditions necessary for things like polarization, these other negative consequences to happen. But the more complex system or circumstance you have, the more potential you have for unintended things to pop out of it.
I bring it back to, as Patrick said, there's never been more information available to us, and to hold it in your head is really, really hard. But I think we can kid ourselves that we know enough about something. And that's the same as when someone walks into a store to buy a TV. They're not the expert, but they will absolutely present as. And I think that goes all the way up. That I don't have an opinion on what's happening around the world because I just don't know enough. But I think there are bunches of people that think, well, I think I've read enough to form an opinion, and things are so complex that you haven't most of the time.
Any other questions? Well, Gemma and then...
So basically we have discussed two words over here, uncertainties and complexities. So basically, let's say for example, there is a business entity which is a particular strategy formulated for a period of 5 years, and then suddenly an uncertainty erupts, like a pandemic or a war or anything which would disrupt the strategies which are formulated by that business entity. Then comes complexities with it. Like now how to navigate with this uncertainty, because now a person who is in the leadership role will have to make new plans and try to convince the executives in the organization to to accept those change in the plans. Now he has to again deal with another type of things which comes with reluctance to change. Now this person is in the middle of two things, uncertainties change in them is just then, and how to convince those executives. So how does a person who is in a leadership position deal with such situation?
Maybe James. How do you deal with it?
So I think there's a couple of things that come to mind. I start with clarity of purpose, because I think when all else fails, that gives you something to aim at all the time. The first presentation I did to the board at JB was the way we think about strategy, and we talked about hypothesis-driven approach to strategy, which is, this is what we think it is right now, so this is the direction we're going, but we're going to check that every quarter. Right? And if it still holds true, we keep going. And if it doesn't hold true, we're going to adjust. And that's the way we've done it. That's the way we've done it for the 8 years that I've been there. And I think that way you can gauge complexity, you can gauge uncertainty, and you can cater for new complexity as you learn it, and you adjust along the way. I think if you, we talk about it, there's no way I'm writing a 3-year strategy. It's just, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know enough about product. I don't know enough about customers. I don't know enough about technology, but I do know enough about a direction that we should be heading. So this I think that kind of holds true for most businesses, that it's a constant check and a constant evolution. But the one thing that doesn't change is our purpose. Why are we doing what we're doing? That doesn't change. So that kind of gives you that navigation to, when all else fails, pull the purpose out of the bottom drawer and just remind yourself as to why you're doing what you're doing.
Can a company have values?
Yeah, absolutely.
That drive that purpose?
Yeah, absolutely. And sorry to talk about JB all the time, but it's a really live example for me, as you can imagine. JB had a mission statement when I first joined, and I kind of challenged it, because it was one of those, be Australia's leading consumer. And I mean, congratulations, mission accomplished, now what, right? So, but purpose it made a whole lot more sense, because JB was an absolute values-driven organisation. Nothing was written down. And that was, as a consultant, I had a panic attack because stuff wasn't written down. But it kind of made sense to talk about something that was, hearts and minds and emotion, because that's the way the business operated. It still had a really strong rational bent, but I kind of make this argument that emotion makes more converts than logic. And JB just used that in its everyday decision making. So you can absolutely have values, and often I hear decisions being made because they say, it's kind of not what we do. Right. Not business case, not strategy, not customer, not market. It's just, it doesn't feel like us. Yeah. And that's a really powerful thing for us. Yeah.
Any other thoughts from anyone? All good?
Just that, absolutely. Organisations can have values, but those values are not necessarily what's in the mission statement, and they can be revealed by the way they act or the decisions they make, rather than being, something that's explicitly stated up front.
Yeah, it's what's written down versus what's in action. Right?
Yeah, it's also different. About the people that are the leaders of those organisations.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I wouldn't say that the companies themselves would have the values. I think it's the people that are leading the companies and the people working in those companies that are the ones that drive the values.
Yeah. Gemma, you had a question.
There are those who really relish unnecessary complexity and can be known to use it as a shield, perhaps for job protection, sometimes out of, just self-esteem issues. There can be a lot that they can benefit from the shield of presenting complexity. So my question would be, for those who are leaders and managers who are trying to work with those who are perhaps hiding behind that complexity, particularly when driving a change agenda, how would you suggest would be good tactics or tools for trying to work with those who are kind of hiding behind an air of complexity? Two heads just straight up.
So two things. I spent 20 years as a management consultant, so I absolutely love complexity because it just created work. But I think there's a so what question in everything. It's kind of go, well, this is really complex, and we go, well, so what? right? And then you kind of unpack that and just keep unpacking. And I think that's a way to, get to the core of what the problem is, but also get people to admit feels a bit Machiavellian, but admit that actually it's not as complex as you think, right? And sometimes it just comes down to what, for us, what happens in a store, what happens when a customer is face-to-face with someone, what happens at the till, what happens when a TV arrives at the back door. It's that simple sometimes. I went to the Da Vinci exhibition at Loom on the weekend, and there was a really great quote that Da Vinci said, and it was, simplicity is the ultimate form of sophistication, right? But I think we get lost in the sophistication and think complexity, but the simplicity is where the action is, right? So I think you've just got to kind of keep challenging the idea and go, and then what? And then what? And then what? Until you get down to, well, it's actually the way we put the glass on the table. That's the bit that matters.
Gini?
So I just won't address your question specifically, but what you said about simplicity, I think when I think about my teaching practice, and when I think about the complexity and myself or students or the way that people hide behind it, I come back to this notion that if I understand it, I can teach it in a way that my audience will understand it as well. And if I don't understand it as well as I think, then I'm going to make it seem complex, and it's going to come across as complex. Because in order to translate it to an audience, you have to know it very, very well. So when I encounter this notion of, it's way too complex, my initial instinct is, well, you should be able to explain it to me in a way that at least the fundamental steps of it aren't. So I try and come back to fundamentals either with those people or with myself when it comes to, is this that complex and what are its building blocks? And in an organizational capacity, I don't know how, in any specific scenario, how much challenging you want to do of another party. But, coming back to those fundamentals, well, what is that first step? What does that look like? And what's the outcome that we're aiming at? Getting those pieces in place, I think, at least from a teaching perspective, and the complexity that I experience in my day-to-day, that's what it comes down to.
Patrick?
Just to add that there's absolutely people who hide behind complexity or who use complexity as a shield. There's at least as often a tendency that we all fall into to assume that things are much simpler than they are. And that I could obviously fix this, or this can obviously be done better, whatever. And I think we need to watch that too, because it's we've all seen people do that where they just sort of bundle into a situation and say, "Oh, this is what you should be doing," without necessarily knowing all the stuff that's going on under the.
I was just going to say, it doesn't mean that some things aren't complex.
Yeah,
they are.
I mean, a combination of humility as well, I think, and the idea of feeling confident to also just make to make decisions. I just wanted to give the three of you an opportunity to kind of finish up in your final thoughts. Maybe I'll start with you, Patrick.
Oh, good.
Summarise.
Complexity is kind of tricky.
Complex.
It's complex, And just to say, it's interesting. We kept coming back to the pandemic and the way in which that sort of blew things out of the water. But it's also important to remember that pandemics are things that people had that happen, on a cycle, and that people have prepared for years, and governments have got responses sitting there waiting to be stood up, which have in some cases kind of atrophied or been underfunded or whatever. So I think it's also important to remember that a lot of uncertainty and a lot of complexity, these are genuine things, but also a big part of it is to also pay attention, because a lot of the things that are uncertain are actually what Kierkegaard, to finish on Kierkegaard, called certain uncertainty, for instance, which is what he said of death, that, death is absolutely going to happen, it's just you don't know when. And so that's something to keep in mind, is that a lot of the big sudden unexpected things aren't actually all that unexpected in retrospect.
Ginny?
I guess my final thoughts would be that constraints are not the enemy. They can actually help guide you towards that creative outcome that you're looking for. So putting some boundaries on yourself can help you achieve more in the end, and being curious, especially when you feel paralyzed by too many opportunities, decisions, be choices, whatever they might be. Putting some boundaries and constraints on that can help you figure out exactly where you want to go.
James?
Probably two things for me. I think the notion of purpose, I think, and why you're doing what you're doing doesn't take complexity away, but I think it helps with what's the next step. And if you can take that next step, you can then take the next step and the next step and hopefully get towards simplicity. And then the last thing I think is the answer for me is rarely add more complexity. And I think we do that with structures and processes and systems and sometimes technology and whatever, rather than saying, I want humans to connect. And I think we can remove some of the complexity if we make that connection.
So, thank you to you both. Before we kind of finish up and have the drinkies and snackies out there, I just wanted to quickly talk to you about the MBA program, because these are, while this might seem fairly kind of high level, these are the types of processes and conversations we have in the MBA program. One of the things that is really interesting as you talked about this was the kind of concept of be curious, and we're about to run our study tour in June, and one of the things that we've decided to do this time is to open it up to people who would like to do it as a single unit, as a kind of taster for the MBA program. And the study tour this year will be going to Milan and Lisbon. And it's not just about fashion or pastel de nata or anything like that. It's actually introducing our MBA students to different ways of thinking, different ways of running a business, but also just different ways of living. And our motto for the study tour is be curious. And it's instilled in the whole conversations that we have. So if you're interested in even just doing an MBA, if you're not already in the program, or if you've done your MBA and you're thinking, I'd like to kind of, go on the study tour, we've now been able to open that up. And by all means, grab me at the outside when you're ready. I'd like to kind of finish by thanking James, Gini and Patrick for their contributions, extraordinary contributions. We've solved all the problem. That's good to get on with life. I also want to thank to Kenny and Tracy from the Deakin events team for organising this. It's been a good turnout for a Wednesday night. We didn't expect this many, and I think that's fantastic. This is a really important part too of our program, is getting people back together. And although the Deakin MBA was well known for being an online MBA, we realise now that our MBA has to be across a range of different ways of delivery, and this is just one of the many ways that we get people to kind of connect with one another and engage on big ideas. So thank you all very much for coming, and thank you to the panellists. I just kind of give you a